Chapter 10, Externalities, when the price is not right. You can think of Happy Gilmore when you think of that. So we're going to cover external costs, external benefits, and efficiency, private solutions to the externality problem, and government solutions to the externality problem. And I apologize, my cat has decided she wants to do some economics today. So if you see her running around or by my head, my apologies. So let's talk about a few situations that are going to make no sense on why we're talking about them economically, but we're going to at least cover them. So, antibiotics, they're overused. We know this. If you go into any doctor's office, you're going to see signs that tell you when you should use antibiotics and when you should not. Now, why is this the case? So, users get all the benefits of using the antibiotics, but they don't bear all the cost. What does that mean? So each time we use an antibiotic, it creates a small increase in bacterial resistance, which is true because then any of the bacteria that still are alive are there and they get a little stronger. So when that happens, it pollutes the environment with more resistant and stronger bacteria. But when you're sick, you don't care about what the future is because you're looking at the present time. Okay? So what this creates is what's called an externality. It's when some of the costs or the benefits fall on bystanders, not just the person who's using the product. So a great example would be like flu shots. We'll cover that here in a little bit, or other items such as like smoking, or situations where you impact somebody that you don't even realize you're impacting because you're using it. So external cost, when you actually somebody else has to pay for it, is called negative externalities, and external benefits are what are called positive externalities. So when we evaluate markets, we tend to find social surplus or social shortage because of these externalities. Okay, so we just mentioned their external costs or benefits. They fall onto the bystanders, and a cost is that people are paying it other than the consumer or the producer. So the private cost is the cost that is paid by the individual or the producer, and the social cost is the cost or the extra benefit to everybody else. So a good way to find it's the total cost minus private cost. You guys don't have to do those calculations, but it's just something to think about. Social surplus. This is the consumer surplus plus the producer surplus. And if it is a positive externality, it could be plus everyone else's surplus that they get in addition to that. Okay? So, for example, let's answer this question. You pay $50 for a new jacket. What kind of cost is this? Should be C, a private cost, because you are the only one getting the benefit out of that jacket. So, we know from our talks a market equilibrium price maximizes consumer plus producer surplus. Now, when a market has an externality, we cannot maximize social surplus. Why? Because the price signals aren't there, thus markets with externalities are inefficient. Okay, so we know what the inefficient or efficient equilibrium and quantity is. That's where we cross those lines. That's where it maximizes surplus. Okay, so when we look at this chart, let's say we started the original gray line here. This is where our normal equilibrium would be. Now, since we have this new supply curve that implies the social cost of something, we find that this area right here is actually inefficient when we really look at these costs. So we would need, for have the efficient equilibrium and quantity, we need to move up here. Okay? So you see where the social cost is there, and you see the private value. So you see that we should move the equilibrium over to the left, or shift this way, and this would actually produce the efficient equilibrium and the efficient maximum to society. Okay? What you find is that when there's a social cost, you do have some deadweight loss. It's the loss that exists because we can't measure that value. Okay? You also see that overuse occurs at the bottom. So we know that a tax on an ordinary good increases deadweight loss. So we talked about that in chapter 6. We showed how you would actually have tax revenue, you would have producer consumer surplus, and when a tax is imposed, everyone is worse off besides the government. So now, let me throw this out a little differently to you. A tax on a good with an external cost, so if it has a cost that we can't see or is spread across other people, then it will actually raise revenue and reduce deadweight loss. So I told you in chapter 6 that all taxes are bad. But I did mention at the end that there are some cases where that's not the case. That's when there are externalities involved, and then there's a tax, and you'll see there's two different kinds we'll talk about, that is imposed to help correct that price signal. Now, Pagot, I don't actually know how to say his last name, he focused on externalities and how you could do it with a tax. So, the Perovian tax is a tax on a good with external cost. Pretty straightforward. So, this is a question that should be pretty easy. We just covered it 2 slides ago. When a tax is imposed on a good with significant external cost, deadweight loss is usually reduced. B. What happens is when you impose that tax, it shows the actual cost that is to the society and it imposes on that user so they have information to make that decision. Okay? So let's talk vaccines and flu shots. So they benefit the person who gets vaccinated, but they also help others. Okay? So people who have a flu shot or a vaccine like polio, whatever other vaccines that people have, your Tdap, your pertussis, your measles, mumps, rubella, they're less likely to spread the disease. So the person who gets the shot is going to have to pay for it. They're going to get the fever, any aches that are involved, but they don't get all the benefits. So what happens? You find that people don't tend to go get as many flu shots or vaccines as they should because they don't get all the benefits that are the case. Okay? So let's explain this with how actually like Walgreens, CVS, and some of those stores have tried to help take this into the next level. So I've mentioned that taxes can be imposed to help those who don't see the extra cost of a good. So say we want a society that has more flu shots so we don't have as many flu epidemics. Now, we know that a lot of insurance companies give you a flu shot for free. So there are some people who don't even want to get that flu shot for free because they don't want to have that pain or take the time to go get that shot. So there's an inefficient number of people getting the flu shot. We need to get it to the point where they actually see the additional benefit that is happening to all of society, not just that one person. Because remember, in this lecture, we're talking about the social good, not just that individual person's good. Because the individual person is always going to act in their own self-interest. That being said, we've got to incentivize them or show them that it is in their own best self-interest because there are extra benefits that are being passed on to society. So how do drugstores do this? Now think about Walgreens, CVS, Meijer, Walmart, and all the incentives they offer if you go get a flu shot there. So like I know Walmart would give you like donate something to a charity. CVS would give you like $10 to spend in store. Kroger would give a meal to a family in need. They started incentivizing people because they wanted them to have a reason to go get that flu shot that provided an additional value to what you would typically think is just a free flu shot. So if somebody will pay you to get something for free, they're essentially providing a subsidy in the form to show you the value of that external benefit. So if you guys have any questions about that when we're in class, you can ask me. I'd be happy to explain it in more detail. So external benefit, this is what happens when people, other than the people that consume the good, get a benefit from that consumption of the good. Okay? So this looks a little different, but it's quite similar. So you see how you have the external benefit. That's where the social value should be. This is what the private value, so the person who's using it, that's the value they're going to get out of it. But we see we should really have more people doing it. So you have this deadweight loss that occurs when that signal isn't translated to everyone else. Okay? And you have underuse. So when there are external benefit, market outputs are too low. So a lot of people try to figure out a subsidy that helps equal that external benefit. That'll shift the demand curve and provides an efficient equilibrium. This subsidy, which is called a Perovian subsidy, it reduces deadweight loss and increases social surplus. It's actually a good thing. Okay? So it's a subsidy on a good with an external benefit. Hope that makes sense. So when there's an external benefit, market's output is usually too low, A, because there's not enough people knowing they should use it. They don't see the external value that is being placed, and it's not internalized. So internalizing an externality. This is what I've been talking about with the flu shot, the vaccines, that kind of stuff. It's when you adjust incentives so that decision makers take into account all of the cost and benefits for their actions, private and social. So basically, you're giving them a price signal to tell them, hey, it's going to cost you this, but you either get this or it's going to cost you even more than this because you're hurting the society bit of it. Okay? So, if we want to hit market equilibrium, and we want it to be an efficient equilibrium when there's externalities, there has to be systematic trading. And to be honest, there's not a lot of this happening. So they can handle it when transaction costs are low and property rights are clearly defined. These conditions aren't met all of the time. Now, what we find is that markets alone, with the additional input of that information takes time to disseminate, and some people don't have all the information when they make decisions, these conditions often aren't met and they can't solve the externality problem. So, a transaction cost. This is all the costs necessary to reach an agreement. Cost of identifying, bringing together buyers, sellers, bargaining, drawing up a contract, credit card costs, any cost that happens when you're making that transaction. So, the Coase theorem. If transaction costs are low and property rights are clearly defined, private bargains will ensure the market equilibrium is efficient even when there's externalities. So if I don't have to spend hours and hours to find what the benefit is to something, and I own whatever property it is, I'm going to take that information and it's going to be better off for me to understand that. So it makes pretty good sense. But the odds are you're not going to have all that information, so this doesn't happen very often. Okay? So this is where the government steps in. Oh boy, if you're an economist, you're like, oh, government. Saying that sarcastically like Ron Swanson in Parks and Rec. So what you tend to find is there's a few different ways they can actually do this. So when external costs are significant, so we have a real big shortage surplus that should be handled, there are a few different ways the government can go step in and kind of try to fix it. So one way is to reduce the cost by making more or making less, forcing them to do so. So the problem is that's a really hard number just to come up with out of the air. We use probable numbers with all the things we show you guys. In the real world, it is not as easy as it looks. So when you don't have all this information, we don't know how that operates. So we use taxes and subsidies to help it because they're a lot more flexible, can easily be changed. Okay? So here's a question. B is your correct answer. So let's give an example. So tradable allowances. Under the Clean Air Act of 1990, the EPA distributes pollution allowances to generators of electricity. Basically, this says, hey guys, you can only produce so much pollution. Don't care. This is your law. Otherwise, you'll get fined and/or you're going to have to shut down. So Congress sets the limit on the total amount of allowances. Basically, it says, hey, you can't do any more pollution other than this, no matter what. So now what's happening is the EPA will watch and monitor that, and they'll shut the companies down if they produce over that limit. And one key fact is that firms can trade or reserve allowances for future use. Key part of the whole situation here is actually something very smart that the government came up with in terms of economics. So this program has been extremely successful. Why? Emissions have been reduced, air quality has been improved, illness has been reduced, generation has increased. You're like, wait a second, you just limited all of this stuff. How is that better? Now let's explain it here. Let's see, I think it does it on the next slide. Under tradable allowances, C is your answer. Okay, let's go back to this example so you guys can understand it. So what's happening here is when a company is allowed to use them for future use or bank them, they can trade them. So people that have the highest valued use for that pollution will use it, and those who don't will either trade to get the money or save it back to a point where they can have that higher valued use for it. It's self-interest in its purest form, but it's with a restriction cap. So it actually creates people, or actually forces people to only use the pollution for their highest valued uses. It's a really interesting study. We can talk about more of this in class. So, Peruvian taxes versus tradable allowances. They are the same thing if the tax is equal to the level of the external cost and the number of allowances is equal to the efficient quantity. They are not the same if there is uncertainty or if there's political preferences for one or the other. Okay? They basically do the same things if those conditions are met. This chart will actually show you like the external tax that is imposed, and we could show you a different way of allowances, but you have to understand exactly where this stuff is to make it work perfectly. So, firms that are given tradable allowances get a big benefit compared to having to pay taxes. Critics say that pollution allowances equal corrective tax plus corporate welfare. So since these allowances can be auctioned off, they generate government revenue, and allowances are more likely to gain cooperation from large firms than taxes. So the idea is you'd rather limit someone's quantity than to make them pay a tax every time they sell something. Why? It's a whole psychological aspect of it. So basically, it's the same thing. They do the same exact thing if enacted properly. But if you can make one sound better than the other, you're a great politician and you're going to get your same achievements done without having to really tick off others. Okay? So we've learned that in a free market, the visible hand can do its work. With externalities, not the case. So there are some solutions to this. There are taxes and subsidies, command and control, and tax or tradable allowances. Now, why does this happen? Because market prices do not correctly signal the true cost. We can fix that by having taxes adjust that cost. Command and control solutions can work, but they're not really feasible in most situations. And we do know, as we go to this one, if property rights are clearly defined, markets can solve the problem themselves, but we know that is not typically the case.